Hi everyone, welcome to our next session in our kids curriculum Bible support content. Hopefully this is helping you wrestle with scripture for yourself so that when you come to spend time at kids church on a Sunday, you're able to really speak with insight and help them to work through what's the most significant thing for them to take away. So I'm Joe, this is Trea.
Hello.
Glad to be back with you. Today we are looking at the story of Isaac. We're jumping into Genesis 21 and 22, which in these chapters is actually the story of Abraham as Isaac is born. So it's actually more about Abraham than Isaac. But everyone remembers Isaac for the sacrifice and not for the other stuff at the end of his life. So for better or for worse, it's what it is.
This story is very impacting.
It is. It's quite jarring for us in our modern ears.
I think so, and I think we quite often first hear it as a child. Yeah. And maybe it's not always taught well.
No.
And so we're going to hopefully go through this today so that we can teach it really well and make sure we're focusing on the right things in this story and not, the wrong things.
I mean, just reading the actual story itself in scripture can be enough for a younger person to go, oh my goodness. But anyway, before we get there...
Makes me question my faith.
In term 2, we've got a new big question. The new big question is...
Yes, who is in control of everything?
And the answer is...
God.
Great. And we've got a new memory verse. We're in Numbers 23:19, which you should read from the NIV.
Yeah, read from the NIV.
Don't read from the ESV.
Please.
So, but about is God a human that he would lie? No, he's not. He makes promises and he sticks to his promises. And great example of that in today's passage.
Yes, and just to remember, we have some talk about covenant, which we have agreed that it's okay to use the word promise to help children understand the word covenant. Covenant obviously being a much more complicated thing, but promise will be okay for our children in this season. So we have this beautiful story of Abraham and his son Isaac, and it is a bit of a tough one. There's some child sacrifice comes up in here,
almost not quite
so close, but really this is a story about faith, and this is a story about trust and faith in God, and it is still landing on that God is a God that keeps his promises, that keeps his covenant. And so that I want to put it out there for us now as we travel through this. This is our point. It's not that Abraham was willing to kill his kid for God or that God would require that. It is the promises and the faithfulness of Abraham following through with what God has asked, because he trusts God and he knows that God is a God that keeps his promises. So as we head into this, why is this story in the Bible?
Well, so you can imagine, so if you're the first heroes of this, you're kind of sitting back and you've had this pretty horrific first kind of sweep of the story where things go from bad to worse. Like it started so nice in the garden and sin just spreads everywhere and there's
people dying,
wholesale destruction,
lots of war,
and everyone's scattered across the earth and all this stuff. And so there's all these attempts of humans to connect back to God in the wrong way, and sin is the result, and sin is part of the problem. And we get to Abraham and it's like, God initiates his promises. But what we see is now a bit of a, oh my goodness, like there's a twist in the tail, there's a little speed bump, there's a barrier because...
It's very jarring.
Yeah, because the covenant promises have been made, but now we're going to see repeatedly through the rest of Genesis these roadblocks and barriers and speed bumps to covenant happening. The first one we came across back in the last story pertains to Isaac, because it was, you'll be a great nation and he can't have kids.
Yeah.
So there's a speed bump. There's a threat to the covenant. Will God come through? How will this happen? We don't understand. Isaac is the result of that. And then there's this next thing. It's like, but will Isaac even make it to being an adult? How will he become the father of the next generation if he doesn't even make it through? And there's all these challenges to the covenant that everyone listening to will be like, you can't do that. That's not going to work. And so there's a lot of questions about why and how this is in the story. It's very easy for us as New Testament believers, followers of God, to really kind of write back onto this story the story of Jesus. And there are elements which obviously resonate, and there's little glimmers of things that we go, oh, that makes sense in the context of hindsight. To the first hearers, they didn't have any of that. So there was some sense of, yes, there's a sacrifice that has to happen. They would have understood all the temple sacrifices. They would have understood that a ram or an animal being sacrificed on behalf of someone else, that's significant. This isn't actually the initiation of all of those things that we see in Leviticus, the Levitical worship. This is actually just another little scene, a little kind of vignette that talks about how Abraham is responding to God's invitation to covenant relationship. And so really the testing is... in some ways, it actually echoes a little bit more of Job for me than it does other stuff, because it's almost... It seems to me like the question is, will Abraham be obedient to God when it doesn't seem to benefit him?
Yes, I think that's
which
kind
is a
of
Job thing, right?
That's a bigger thing that I think sometimes we do. We're like, oh, he's going to sacrifice his son like God sacrificed his son Jesus, and that's because we have this story now. But when people are reading this, they don't have Jesus to draw on, and this is a story of faithfulness. This is a story of, hey, God is asking me to do something. What is more important to me? You know, my way or God's way.
Yeah.
And God's way. God has made his promise. He said that he will bring a great nation, and this is your child, your singular child. So, like,
well, there's Ishmael, but we don't talk about Ishmael.
Yeah. It's awkward. That's like we don't talk about Bruno. We should make a song. Let's make a kids' church song so that we don't talk about Ishmael.
Yeah.
I can hear it in my head.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, and that's really the challenge, is that that starts to make sense of why this very awkward story that seems that God's character changes, God's nature is only like, does he expect child sacrifice? It's and one of the things to remember is testing is different to tempting.
Yes.
And so seeing the state and the nature of Abraham's heart after what's essentially 10 chapters of the story, which is the better part of, Isaac is able to carry wood and have a very clear conversation with his dad. So he's at least 10, could be a teenager. And so this is some maybe 20 years up to maybe more, 25 years after the initial promise that I will make you a great nation.
Yeah. So
this is a long span of time. And so it's almost as if God's saying, do you really understand who I am?
Yeah.
How much will you rely on me and my provision, and how much will you rely on yourself? Because we know from the last section that Abraham's a man of means, so much that he and Lot can't live in the same place because they'll destroy the local economy and ecosystem. And so, how much is Abraham going to trust that God is going to come through his end of the deal?
And I just think about if I was a child and I'm, hearing the story, say 100 years after this has happened, my parents are sitting me down and telling me the story of the garden, and then the story of the flood, and the story of the tower. Then they're telling me about Abraham, and then they tell me this story. I think as a child, first of all, I'd be like, say what? Like, what? He took him up and he lay him down, he bound him.
That close,
and then you hear that part, but then God, an angel spoke and said, what are you doing? And said, hey, there's the ram for you to sacrifice. There would be a faithfulness as a child that would rise up in me that would go, wow, like God can do anything. Like God provided what was needed. And so I think there's such an element in here where there's like this moment of and then you trust God again, which is life, right? Which is life where things are not always going our way. And sometimes God's like, do you trust me in this moment, this difficult moment? And then we see God show up in a powerful and amazing way. So let's send our kids in that direction, not in the child sacrifice. Was God testing Abraham? Well, there's definitely an element of a test here.
Oh, definitely.
And Abraham...
But it's totally set up.
The
ram's there already. The whole thing's organised.
And he's already said, I will make a great nation from you. So there's obviously a deep, loving relationship between Abraham and God here as well, that he is willing.
There's something, we're starting to see it emerge, and we'll see it happen. It's really interesting too how these stories go. So there's a huge overlap and interweaving of the different generations. And so... and as you can imagine, Abraham's story doesn't really end until Isaac's story has begun, because there's this beautiful overlap. And so this generational kind of flow happens. This is a really significant story in the history of faith, in particularly the Jewish and the Christian faith. It's got its own name. It's called the Akedah, because the offering of Isaac. Said to happen at Mount Moriah, which is the future site of the temple in Jerusalem. Why they didn't say Jerusalem, because Salem, which exists, was mentioned about 5 chapters earlier. But if it's not Salem, we don't know where else it is. And it seems to be the Temple Mount where he goes up. So there's there's already kind of allusions there that he's going to sacrifice on the Temple Mount. Again, don't be too quick to instantly fully equate it to Jesus, because remember, Jesus wasn't sacrificed on the Temple Mount. He went out to a hill outside the city. But there's this whole process where Abraham is essentially testing his faith, and this comes up then in Hebrews 11 about Abraham this is counted to him as righteousness because of his faith in God. And so, I'd be hesitant to just instantly map it all onto the story of Jesus, but I think what you can draw out is that yes, like Abraham was intending to sacrifice Isaac. God the Father actually went through with his sacrifice of his son, Jesus. And yes, there's a sheep. It's not a lamb, it's a ram. So it's not quite the same. So I wouldn't jump into that, but I would actually go, look, it does give us a bit of a picture of a loving God who would do something in order to save someone else. There's no idea of salvation or anything in this story. So it's not the same story, but it definitely is bringing up themes of what does a father do? How do people interact? What does faithfulness look like? So God's not condoning human sacrifice.
Yes, I was going to say, there's some tough questions that kind of come out of this, like, is God pro-child sacrifice?
No. And it's interesting, actually, some of the research I was doing, there's not as much written about child sacrifice in the ancient world as people may suspect. So Abraham probably would have been aware of it. It may have been practiced in different religions that he was around, that maybe he was even a part of back in but it's not a condoning of this is what we do. That's borne out right through the rest of the Old Testament, and particularly when we get to Moses, which will happen in a few weeks' time, and we get that next iteration of now the people of God, Israel, which they become by the time of Moses. God's clarifying what this relationship with him looks like and how they interact. And so we're still quite early, so don't be too quick to jump ahead and decide this is what sacrifice is all about and this is what God's saying and doing. God's establishing relationships. So it's not a moral story.
No.
It's not... how
much do you love your child?
Yeah, it's not about do you love God more than you love your family. That's not the conversation.
No, that is not the conversation. Please don't have that conversation.
Abraham clearly loves Isaac. It's not easy for him to do this. So, I would again talk about what is faithfulness to God and trusting in his promises mean in your life.
Yeah, and so we have some nice things we can do to set up the story yet again. So you can do some of those things where you do talk to kids about what are some things that you really love and would you be willing to give it up or not give it up. So some of those great games, and this is just set up your story. Yeah, not family. Talk about Nintendos.
Well, even like, would you follow God if you didn't get that?
Yes,
kind of posturing it, not like, would you give this up for God, but...
Yes, and I think you could even avoid...
get something out of it.
You could even avoid, I think, even saying, would you give it up for God, or just would you give it up? Just talking to kids about it, like kind of making them start to think about, would I be willing to give up my Nintendo? No. And you do that game where they walk from one side of the room to the other. You see, like, who's willing, who's not willing. Yeah. What is it of value to you? And that just starts them thinking about, wow, like Abraham had real faith because he was willing to give it up. But he didn't have to, because God had a plan and a promise that he was fulfilling.
It makes me think of this old song we used to sing when I was in kids' church, which we would not get away with anymore.
There's a few. We
used to sing the words were, God is better than football, God is better than beer.
Is that a Colin Buchanan song?
I think so.
It's got to be a Colin Buchanan song.
It's just like, God is better than these things. Like, and in being in relationship with him, you won't miss out. Like, that's the coolest thing.
I love that.
We used to sing that in church. And we're Baptists. It's so weird. Anyway.
Really anything in this time with kids, when you play a game or do something where they need to follow instructions, and you don't get the outcome without following the instructions. So even things where you give kids, if you get them to read a whole thing, but at the very bottom it says, now don't do any of this, and just sit down. But children that actually read the whole thing first will know to just sit down. And children that just kind of start it out and start making a mess, they might realise at the end, I didn't actually have to do all of that. I should have listened to the whole picture and known the whole picture. So those are some ways you can set that up. But I think it's really important, as we've spoken about, you want to make that point that, this is a story of trust and faith. Yeah. And it's counted to Abraham as righteousness later on in the New Testament, that he had faith, that he trusted God with his son Isaac, and we can trust God with things that are important to us, and we can trust his promises, and then we can bring that back to Jesus, not in a way of actually connecting the two
Isaac
stories.
is Jesus,
Isaac is not Jesus. He didn't die, and he wasn't raised to life in this story. But we can bring that back to Jesus, in that Jesus is the fulfillment of a promise that we could be with God. And so we have that as well, that we can bring that back around in our Christ connection to Jesus, that he's the fulfillment of a promise, and that we now have Jesus with us, which gives us Holy Spirit. And
which means we walk by faith. And this is what Abraham was doing, walking by faith and not by sight. So.
And asking kids, is there something we need to trust God with at the moment? Is there something?
You play that great game where you blindfold one of the kids and the other people have to direct them around the room.
I love those games. Look at you. You've got all this time you've got the secret Survivor. Kids pastor in here.
Seeing Survivor games that little kids can play, it's always hilarious. Yeah.
But we hope that this helps you teach this story well. We want to lean away from the, does Abraham love his son? Of course he does. Does God love? Of course he does. Yeah. This is not the focus of the story. This story is, although a story about Isaac, it is really a story about Abraham and his faith, and that God is a God that keeps his promises. So let's stay in that space there when we teach this story. Thanks.